Just one night, that's all I ask. The rancher agreed, then he saw a scar on her shoulder. Wild West. The dusty wind of the plains swept across the small frontier town, carrying with it the smell of leather and sweat. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings. It was the kind of evening where the world seemed to slow down, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of a wagon and the distant calls of cattle. The town, with its saloon and general store, was a quiet place, and most people kept to themselves. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke, and the dim light from the oil lamps flickered on the rough-hewn wooden tables. The clink of poker chips and the shuffle of cards filled the room, as cowhands and travelers tried to pass the time before the next ride. At the far end of the bar sat a man in his late 30s, his face rugged from years of hard work under the sun. His name was Jake Mitchell, a rancher who had spent most of his life tending to cattle and working the land. His broad shoulders and strong hands were a testament to the labor that had shaped him. Jake took a long drink from his whiskey glass and set it down with a soft clink. He wasn't one to seek company, but the saloon was the only place to get a drink after a long day. He stared out the window at the fading light of day, his thoughts far away, when the door swung open. A woman stepped inside, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to still. She wasn't like the usual women who came through these parts. She was different. Her hair, dark and wild, fell to her shoulders, and her eyes, a striking shade of green, scanned the room before settling on him. Her clothes were worn, her boots scuffed, and there was a certain air about her, something that made her stand apart from the crowd. She walked with purpose, her gaze never wavering. The murmur of conversation stopped, and all eyes followed her as she approached the bar. Jake noticed the way she carried herself, confident, but there was something else. A sadness in her eyes, as if she had seen too much, done too much to be carefree like the other women. "Whiskey," she said, her voice low but clear. Jake nodded and motioned to the bartender to serve her. He studied her out of the corner of his eye, curious. She wasn't like the others who came and went, always asking for attention or a handout. She seemed different. The woman took the glass from the bartender and gave him a nod of thanks. Her fingers brushed the edge of the glass, and she brought it to her lips, taking a slow sip. The room had resumed its hum, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something about her was pulling him in. After a few moments, she turned to face him, her green eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that neither of them wanted to make the first move. But the silence lingered, heavy with the weight of what wasn't said. "You're the rancher, aren't you?" she asked, her voice still calm but with an edge of curiosity. Jake raised an eyebrow. "I am... Been around these parts for long?" she pressed. He nodded slowly, long enough to know the way the land moves, and the way people do, too. She studied him, her eyes sharp. "I've heard a lot about you." But before he could ask, she continued. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said. "I just need a place to stay for the night." Jake's brow furrowed slightly. Something in her tone told him that this wasn't a simple request. There was more to it, but he wasn't about to push her. The past had taught him not to ask too many questions about strangers. "Got a place for the night?" Jake said, his voice steady. "But I'll be honest, it's just a cabin out on the edge of town. No luxuries." She smiled faintly, as if the idea of a quiet, simple night was exactly what she was looking for. "Just one night," she said, her voice softer now. "That's all I ask." Jake stared at her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. She didn't seem like the type of woman to just ask for a place to stay. There was something deeper, something darker, behind her words. But for some reason, he didn't question her. He just nodded and stood up. "Come on, then," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Let's get going." The walk to his cabin wasn't long, and the evening air was cool against their skin. As they made their way through the quiet town, Jake couldn't help but wonder why she had come here, to this small, quiet place. What had led her to this moment, asking for just one night? Once they reached the cabin, Jake opened the door and led her inside. The room was simple. Just a bed, a chair by the fire, and a small table. The smell of wood and earth filled the air. It was far from luxurious, but it was enough for a weary traveler. She set her bag down by the door and took a seat by the fire. Jake poured them both a drink, and they sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. "I didn't ask for your sympathy," she said after a long pause, her voice steady. "I just needed a place to rest. Somewhere safe, even if it's only for tonight." Jake nodded, his eyes watching the flames. He didn't need to know her story. It wasn't his place to ask. He knew that much. "I understand," he replied. She didn't say anything more. The night stretched on, and the silence between them became more comfortable. There was no need for words now. But as the hours passed, Jake found his mind wandering, trying to piece together the enigma of this woman sitting in his cabin. Who was she really? What had she been through? Later, as the fire began to die down and the room grew darker, Jake stood and moved toward the window. The moonlight streamed in through the cracks in the shutters, casting long shadows across the room. He glanced back at her, noticing for the first time the way the moonlight reflected off her skin. That's when he saw it. A scar. It ran along her shoulder, just barely visible under her worn shirt. It was long, jagged, and had clearly been there for years. But there was something about it, something that made it seem like it was a part of her, a mark of something she had survived, something she didn't want to talk about. Jake didn't ask. He didn't need to. But the sight of the scar stayed with him, lingering in his thoughts as the night stretched on. The woman's request for just one night felt like it held so much more. A plea for peace, for a moment of calm in a world that had undoubtedly given her nothing but pain. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin, as if it was waiting for something to break it. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light across the room. Outside the wind stirred the trees, but inside there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Jake sat on the worn armchair by the fire, sipping his whiskey slowly. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, sat across from him, her back straight, her posture stiff. It was as if she were always ready to spring into action, her mind constantly alert. She wasn't like the other women he had met who talked to pass the time or tried to charm their way into company. She was different, quieter. But there was a storm behind her eyes, a storm that Jake wasn't sure he wanted to face. He glanced over at her again. She hadn't said much since they'd arrived. She just sat there, watching the fire flicker, lost in her own thoughts. Her face was still, but there was a tension in her jaw, as though she were holding something back. "Do you mind if I ask where you're from?" Jake finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. She looked into the fire, as if weighing whether or not to answer. Jake had learned long ago not to push. Sometimes people didn't want to talk, and he was okay with that. But tonight, there was something about her that made him want to know more. He felt a strange pull, an urge to understand who she was, why she seemed so different. "I'm from a long way off," she said finally, her voice soft but carrying a certain weight. She didn't look at him when she spoke, and her words were measured, as though she were choosing them carefully. "I've been on the move for a long time. Sometimes it's easier that way." Jake took a slow sip from his glass, not pressing her for more details. It wasn't his place to ask. But there was something in her words that made him wonder what had happened in her past, wonder what she was running from. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. Then she spoke again, her voice tinged with something darker. "Sometimes you don't get to choose where you end up," she said, her gaze shifting toward the window, where the moonlight streamed in through the cracks in the shutters. "You just find yourself somewhere, and you make the best of it." Jake could hear the unspoken pain in her words. He didn't need to ask her more. There were many people in this world who had been broken by the things they had seen, the lives they had lived, and it was clear that this woman, though strong, was no exception. "I know what that's like," Jake said quietly, his voice distant. "There's a lot of places you can end up that don't feel like home, a lot of people who don't make it through." The woman turned her head slightly, her eyes locking with his. For the first time since they had met, she seemed to soften, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jake to notice. She was starting to let her guard down, just a bit. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you here?" Jake hesitated. His past wasn't something he liked to talk about. It wasn't filled with the same kind of pain and tragedy that the woman seemed to carry with her, but it was his own story, one he had kept hidden for years. "I've been here all my life," he said simply. "Grew up on a ranch, learned the ropes from my father, took over when he passed." There was nothing more to say. He didn't need to explain the loneliness that came with living in a place like this, where the land was vast and empty, and the only company was the cattle. He didn't need to mention the nights he spent staring out at the stars, wondering if there was more to life than this endless stretch of earth. The woman nodded, her eyes moving back to the fire. She didn't press him further. For a moment they simply sat in the quiet, the distance between them narrowing, even if just slightly. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He studied the woman across from him. There was something about her that made him feel both curious and protective. He could tell she had seen things, lived through things that had changed her. But there was also something about her that made him believe she could survive whatever the world threw at her. She wasn't the type to give up. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" Jake finally said, his voice still quiet but sincere. The woman met his gaze, her green eyes steady. "Go ahead." Jake's brow furrowed as he hesitated, then asked, "What happened to you? I mean, how did you get that scar?" The question had been lingering on his mind ever since he had first seen the jagged mark across her shoulder. He hadn't meant to ask, but the curiosity had gotten the better of him. It wasn't his place to pry into her past, but there was a part of him that couldn't help but wonder. For a long moment, the woman didn't respond. She stared into the fire, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched the scar on her shoulder, her fingers brushing the rough skin. "It's a reminder," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Jake's heart tighten. "A reminder of what I survived, what I had to do to stay alive." Jake didn't push. He knew better than to ask for more details. There was a story there, a story of survival, of pain, of choices she had made that had brought her to this point, but it wasn't a story she was ready to tell. The woman stood up and walked over to the window, her back to him. Jake watched her, his mind filled with questions. He could sense that whatever had happened to her, whatever had marked her, was something she carried with her every day. It was a part of her, just like the scar on her skin. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But in that silence, something passed between them. A mutual understanding. Neither of them was asking for answers. Neither of them was expecting anything more than what had already been shared. "I didn't come here for sympathy," she said, her voice steady. "I came here because I needed a place to rest. Just for tonight." Jake nodded. He understood. Sometimes that's all anyone needed. A place to rest. A moment of peace. "Rest then," he said, his voice soft. "You're safe here." Jake leaned back in his chair, and the woman returned to her seat by the fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound in the room, and for the first time that night, the weight of the world seemed to lift, if only for a moment. The morning light crept through the gaps in the shutters, casting soft lines across the floor. The fire from the night before had faded into a few glowing embers, and the cabin was cool and still. Jake awoke first, as he usually did, the quiet of the early hours filling his senses. He stretched and quietly rose from the chair where he had spent the night. The cabin, small and simple, felt peaceful in the morning light, but there was an unease in the air, a tension that had been there since the moment the woman walked through the saloon doors. Jake made his way to the stove, starting a pot of coffee. The smell of the brewing coffee was one of the few things that could make a man feel truly at home, no matter how far from the ranch he might be. He worked quietly, preparing breakfast, letting the day unfold slowly. It wasn't long before he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see the woman standing in the doorway, her expression still calm but distant, as it had been last night. "Morning," Jake said, his voice low, as he poured the coffee into 2 cups. She nodded, not saying anything at first. Then, without looking at him, she stepped into the small kitchen and took a seat at the table, her gaze fixed on the window. Her face was tired, as if sleep hadn't come easy for her. There was something about her, a quiet strength that made Jake wonder what her life had been like. She wasn't like anyone he had met before, and it made him curious. After a few moments, he placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. "Thought you might like some," he said, sitting down across from her. The woman glanced at the cup but didn't immediately take it. Her fingers hovered above it for a moment before she wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her cold skin. She looked down into the coffee, her thoughts far away. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice soft. Jake waited for her to speak, knowing she wasn't one to share much unless she was ready. And yet there was something in the air, a sense that the silence between them was too heavy to continue. After a long pause, she finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was a quiet determination in her gaze. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I wasn't always like this," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a kind of sadness. "I didn't grow up running, looking over my shoulder every second. I had a family once, a real family." Jake listened, not interrupting. He didn't ask for her story, but there was something in her voice that made him feel like he needed to know. It was as though he were hearing the first notes of a song he knew he would never forget. The woman took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I had a father, a mother, a brother. We were a normal family once. But things changed, she continued, her voice low. I was just a girl when it all started. My father worked for a rancher, a man who owned a lot of land. I don't know what happened. Some bad deal gone wrong, I guess. But one day, everything changed. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't need to ask what kind of changes she was talking about. He had heard enough stories in his time to know what could happen when things went bad. I don't know why they came after us, she went on, her voice almost a whisper. They just did. I was 13 when they killed my father. They came in the middle of the night, and there was nothing we could do. They took everything from us. My mother, she died a year later. I don't even know what happened to her. She just faded away. Her words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Jake understood why she seemed so distant. He could see it now, the cracks in the walls she had built around herself. After my father died, I left, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't stay in that place. So I ran. I've been running ever since. I changed my name. Changed my face. But no matter how far I go, I can't outrun the past. He could see now that the scar on her shoulder was more than just a mark of battle. It was a symbol of everything she had lost, of the pain she carried with her every single day. He didn't know what to say. There were no words that could make this better, no words that could ease the pain she had lived through, but he didn't need to speak. Silence between them spoke volumes. I thought that maybe coming here would give me some peace, she said, her voice softer now. But I didn't know what I was asking for. I don't think I'll ever find peace. Not after everything that's happened. Jake reached out, his hand resting on the table between them. He wasn't sure why he did it, but something told him it was the right thing. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if wondering if he could truly understand. I'm sorry, Jake said simply. He didn't know what else to say. The woman took a deep breath and nodded. It's not your fault, she said quietly. It's just the way things are. Some people get to live their lives. Some of us just have to survive. They sat in silence again, the weight of her words settling between them. The room was still, but there was a sense of understanding in the air, a bond that had formed without either of them needing to speak more. Jake wanted to say something to make her feel better, but he knew that nothing he could say would fix the past. He didn't have the answers, and he didn't think anyone did. Sometimes people just needed to be heard, and tonight, that was what he could offer her. I never asked for your sympathy either, the woman said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. I just wanted to rest for one night. That's all. After everything that happened, I thought I could finally let my guard down. Jake nodded, understanding. He didn't offer any words of comfort because he knew that sometimes the best thing to offer was just silence. Just being there. He could see that she wasn't expecting anything from him except for a safe place to be. Take as much time as you need, Jake said, his voice low but sincere. You're safe here. She leaned back in her chair, her shoulders easing just a little. There was a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, and for the first time, she seemed to believe him. The weight of the world had not disappeared, but for a moment the burden seemed a little lighter. The morning stretched on quietly as they both sat in silence. The past wasn't something that could be erased, and peace wasn't something that could be found overnight. But for the moment, it was enough. And for Jake, that was all he could offer. The day stretched on slowly, each moment filled with an unspoken understanding between Jake and the woman. They had spent the morning in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The warmth of the fire had faded, and the soft light of the afternoon sun filtered through the shutters. The air was still, and the world outside seemed to wait patiently, as though it knew what was coming. Jake had been through many days like this, quiet, uneventful, and routine. But today it felt different. There was a weight in the air, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the woman's story, although that had changed the way he saw her. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The woman had spent the morning preparing to leave. She moved around the cabin quietly, packing her things. Jake had offered to make her breakfast, but she had declined, saying she wasn't hungry. She seemed distant again, closed off. He understood. It was how she had been when she first arrived, when they had shared that first night together. She wasn't the type to stay, and Jake had known that from the start. He stood by the window looking out over the land. The ranch stretched for miles, the green fields dotted with cattle, and the occasional cluster of trees. It was peaceful, but it was also empty. There were days when Jake felt like he was the only person alive in the world, and today was one of those days. He couldn't help but feel the woman's departure as if it were his own. Do you think you'll be all right? Jake asked, his voice soft but sincere. The woman paused as she was gathering her things, turning toward him. There was a brief moment of silence before she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I'll be fine," she said, her eyes steady. "I'm used to it. I always am." The way she said it made him wonder if she truly believed those words herself. She had lived a hard life, and even if she didn't show it, it was clear that the scars on her body and in her heart weren't things she could just walk away from. He walked over to where she stood by the door, looking down at her small bag. She had everything she needed, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just leaving the cabin. She was leaving a part of herself behind, a part she couldn't take with her. "I don't know where you're headed," Jake said slowly. "But if you ever need anything, if you ever need a place to rest again, you know where to find me." For a brief moment, Jake thought she might say something, might tell him that she appreciated the offer. But instead, she simply nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," she replied quietly. Jake wasn't sure what he had expected her to say. Maybe something more. Maybe she would stay. Maybe she would offer some kind of explanation for why she had come into his life, even if only for a short time. But she didn't. She wasn't the kind of person who needed anyone, who depended on anyone. She had learned long ago that the world wasn't kind, and relying on others was dangerous. It was better to keep moving, to keep running, than to ever stop. But Jake couldn't help feeling that there was more to her than she let on. More to her past, more to her story. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. He had known people like her before, people who carried their past like a heavy load, never letting anyone in, never letting anyone see the pain they carried. And Jake knew deep down that if she ever decided to stop running, she could find peace. But it wasn't up to him to make that happen. She had to decide that for herself. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Jake said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "Whatever that is." The woman smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know the truth, but they're not ready to admit it. "I'm not looking for anything anymore," she said, her voice steady. "I used to think I could find peace, but peace isn't something you can find.
It's something you make for yourself.
And right now, I don't know if I can make it." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He had never been good with words when it came to matters of the heart. He could talk cattle and weather all day, but this was different. He knew there was no easy answer, no quick fix for the kind of pain she had endured. He could offer her a place to stay, a safe space, but he couldn't offer her the peace she was searching for. "I understand," Jake said quietly, "but just know you don't have to do it alone." She just stood there, looking at him, as if she were weighing his words. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "I appreciate it." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Jake watched her, his heart heavy with something he couldn't explain. He wanted to stop her, to tell her that she didn't have to leave, that she didn't have to keep running. But he knew it wasn't his place. She had to make that choice for herself. As the door closed behind her, Jake stood still for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had just been. The cabin felt quieter now, emptier, as though her presence had been the one thing that had filled the space. He took a deep breath and turned back toward the window, looking out over the land. The ranch was the same as it had always been. The cattle grazed peacefully in the fields, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the mountains stood tall and steady in the distance. But something had changed inside Jake. A small part of him had shifted, and he wasn't sure if it would ever be the same. He thought about the woman, her strength, her resilience, and the scars she carried. He didn't know if she would ever come back, or if she would ever find what she was looking for. But he hoped she would. He hoped that one day she would stop running, stop hiding from her past, and find the peace she deserved. And for the first time in a long time, Jake realized that maybe, just maybe, peace wasn't something you found. Maybe it was something you made. And perhaps he thought that that was the first step toward understanding what it truly meant to live.